pay your taxes to Caesar and you pay your life to God. That's the point of the text. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Today we are in Luke chapter 20, beginning there in verse 19, down through verse 26. And as you can see from verse 19, we're going to read it again together, verse 19 that is. I want you to see something. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. They're seeking to lay their hands upon Jesus. And I wish that our English translation would do the Greek a little better justice, because the laying on of hands here is a violent action. It means to actually seize somebody with the intent of putting handcuffs on them, to seize somebody in order to arrest them, okay? This is not a gentle laying on of hands. They mean to do Jesus violence. They mean to do Jesus harm. They hate Jesus at this point. The chief priests, the scribes, the elders of the people. And what I want you to see is this, is remember that this text this morning, it comes as a continuation of last week's text. You remember that Jesus told the parable of the wicked tenants last week. And essentially, the meaning of the parable is this, is that God in his gracious love had sent the prophets to the people of Israel and to their leaders, prophet after prophet, to preach to them, to call them to repentance, to call them to give God the things that he is owed, to give God his due. But time and again, they mistreated and even put to death the prophets that God had sent to the people of Israel. Whereas you and I would have run out of patience a long time ago, God's grace just goes on and on and on, further than we could ever imagine. And so God does something no one would have expected. He actually sends his beloved Son to the people of Israel. And that's where Jesus is right now. God has sent his beloved Son to the people of Israel. And in that parable, he tells them, God sends his Son to you, and yet you treat him with malcontent, you abuse him, you mistreat him, you traumatize him, and you will put him to death and throw him outside the city. And that's what they would do to Jesus within just a couple of days of this text that we're reading this morning. They would take Jesus outside of the city of Jerusalem, and they would crucify him and treat him as a criminal. You may say, this is the Christmas season. Why aren't we hearing Christmas sermons? Friends, this is a Christmas sermon. Remember that Jesus was born as a babe there in Bethlehem, there in the manger, not in order to be a child. He was not born in the manger just to teach us great things and to be a wonderful or the perfect example. He wasn't just born into the world to live a perfect life. Jesus was born into the world for this purpose, to end up in the temple where he would eventually be betrayed, handed over to the rulers of the Romans, handed over to them, and they would beat him, mock him, and crucify him. 3 days later, he would rise from the dead, and then he would ascend into heaven. And that's where the book of Acts actually begins. Luke ends after the resurrection, and Acts begins there at the ascension of Jesus. And we are nearing those days very quickly in our preaching through the Gospel of Luke. But Jesus was born in a manger so that he could go to Jerusalem and die for the sins of the world, to die for your and my sins, so that any one of us, anybody in the world, can trust in Jesus, be forgiven of their sins, and be granted eternal life. That just as Jesus was raised from the dead, so also you can be raised from the dead. But not all people accepted Jesus. And Jesus told that parable of the wicked tenants against the leaders of Israel. They hated him for it, and their hostility is essentially boiling over at this point. And it's going to come to a crescendo here before too long, and they actually are going to put Jesus to death. And so the scribes and the chief priests, they sought to lay hands on Jesus at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them. But they feared the people. But they feared the people. Something terribly backwards about this, I fear. Here's Jesus proven to these people in the temple time and again that he's not just Jesus, he is actually the Son of God. He is Emmanuel, God with us, God in the flesh. He's proved this time and again when he turns the water into wine, when he walks on water, when he calms the water and the waves. The disciples are there on their boat as he heals people with leprosy and all sorts of diseases. He makes the lame to walk. He makes the paralyzed man to dance. And in fact, he raised the dead man Lazarus back to life. He had proved time and again that he's not just a man, he is the Son of God. In fact, I would presume to say that some of these scribes and chief priests, elders of the people, many of these people here in the temple, as they had been following Jesus, some of these people had actually ate bread from Jesus' hands after he multiplied it. Took just a few loaves and a few fish and multiplied it twice, actually, 2 different occasions at least. He fed thousands and thousands of people. They know that Jesus is the Son of God, but they will do anything that they can do to silence their critics. Man will go a long way in order to justify his sin. Man would do it back then, and man does it now. Friend, be careful about finding ways to justify your sin. And if you're not watchful for it with your own eyes, with your own soul, you'll end up doing it, and you won't even realize that you are trying to justify your wrongdoing, or that you are trying to silence somebody who is critical of your wrongdoing. But they want to put Jesus to death. And this is what seems so backward to me. Jesus had proven to them that he is the Son of God, yet for the fear of people, they can't put God to death. They're more scared of people than they are of God. They are so scared of the people that they can't put Jesus, the Son of God, to death. They have the whole paradigm of worship upside down. They worship the opinions of men. And the fact is it is very likely that there are some people in this room who you worship the opinions of men. You worship what people think about you. You live and die for what people think about what you wear or what you drive or what house you live in or the way that your family is perceived in the community. And you live for the opinions of men. You have the paradigm of worship flipped upside down. And that's what these men have flipped upside down. They're exactly what the Apostle Paul talked about there in Romans chapter 1, verse 25, where he says that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. And they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. We find ourselves in an awkward world, in an upside-down world, when we worship and serve man rather than God. They want to put Jesus to death, but they can't because they're ruled by men. Better to live for God and not care what men think. You can be free from the opinions of people, free from that dictatorship if you'll just care about what Jesus thinks. But these men, that God doesn't even come into their thinking. They're trying to preserve themselves. They love their sin so much that they would put their Lord to death. So look at verse 20. This is the plan of these men as it unhatches. Verse 20 says, "So they watched Jesus and sent spies who pretended to be sincere that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor." This is the wickedness of man on full display. The wickedness of man on full display. They love their sin so much that they would kill their Lord. They love their sin so much that they would try to deceive their God. So they send spies who pretended to be sincere. I think there's a bit of wisdom here that we need to take from this passage. Just as we're here, something that we need to think about is this. Be very careful of the praises of man. Be very careful of the good things that people say about you, because just because somebody compliments you does not mean that they are with you. Be very careful of the praises of man. Be very careful of the flattery of man. This is one of the main reasons why it's not good to live for the applause of men, because men can have wicked motives. These men have very wicked motives. And I'm going to give you a story here in just a moment where you'll see this in full action. It says in the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, verse 6, faithful are the wounds of a friend. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. It essentially means this, that if a man is truly your friend, if a woman is truly your friend, if you have a true friend, they will be willing, this is the test of a true friend, if they are willing to look you in the face and tell you, you are wrong. That is a true friend. You don't need to be surrounded with yes men who think that everything that you do is right. That's not a faithful friend. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. A faithful friend is willing to look at you and say, those pants do not look good. Don't do that. Stop. Think a little more seriously. A faithful friend is willing to come to you and say, look, I know that you want to move away and take another job. You realize if you do that, your wife's going to leave you. You realize you're making the dumbest mistake of your life. You need to quit being so stupid. Oh man, that's harsh. That's loving if it's the truth. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Surround yourself with people who will tell you the truth. That's what the people I try to surround myself with, because everybody wants to tell a pastor, even though he preaches crummy sermons, they want to say, that's a good sermon. I want to surround myself with people who say, that really wasn't that good a sermon. You really need to improve here. You've got some things that you really need to adjust and you really need to change. Surround yourself with people that are going to tell you the truth. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, and God is the most faithful friend you can ever have, because he will tell you when you are wrong. He will correct you, and if you are a faithful follower of Christ, you will correct yourself when he calls you to the carpet, when he calls you to the rug. But that's not where the proverb ends. As is indicative or consistent with Proverbs here, there's one statement made, and then the contrapositive of that statement is made as well. Proverbs 27:6 says, faithful are the wounds of a friend. Profuse, meaning there's a lot of them, they just overflow over that cup. Profuse are the kisses of the enemy. So a friend will wound, but an enemy will kiss. An enemy will tell you how wonderful you are, how great you are, how good it is, all the things that you do, but they have ill wishes at hand. Give you a little story here. Still makes my skin crawl. The Lord seems to have handled this situation in his own wise way, though. First church that I served in, there was a man in the church, an older man, and he came to me, and I was much younger than I am now, okay? And at that point, I was swimming in foolishness. I hope now I'm just wading in it. At that point, I was swimming in it, okay? Swimming in foolishness. Well, this older man came to me and said, hey, I'd love to take you to lunch sometime. You name the place, I'll take you. It's on me. Just want to get to know you. And I thought, great, man. This older man is showing me deference. He's paying attention to me. He's showing me respect. Man, I kind of like this. This guy must have my best interest at heart. And so he took me to lunch there in town. I can still remember what restaurant it was. I can still remember where we sat. And I sat there across the table from this man. He said, anything you want on the menu. You should know something's up at that point, right? He said, anything you want on the menu, you just ordered it. It's on me this morning. Okay, so I ordered my food, and we just sat there and talked, and we ate, and it was great conversation. And I'm just wondering the whole time, what is this about? What does he want? People normally want things. What does he want? And I sat there and ate, and he waited until the food hit my stomach, had a couple of glasses of sweet tea, was happy, feeling good. And then he said, Jordan, I'd like to talk to you about something. And there it was. There he started. after a profuse amount of kissing up and sucking up, not the faithful wounds of a friend, the profuse kisses of the enemy, he began to ask me about things he had no business asking me about and trying to put things in my heart he had no business putting there. He had ill wishes from the beginning. People, do not listen to all of the compliments that people give you. There is one person in this world, in all of the universe, whose opinion matters. It's Jesus. Listen to him and don't be swayed by the opinions of men. People may be sincere. They may not be sincere. They may have ill content at their heart. Then again, sometimes when people compliment you, understand that they're going by a bad rubric. They don't know what they're grading. That's why sometimes when people say to me, man, that was a great sermon. That's the best sermon I've ever heard. My response is, you need to hear more sermons. Because they don't understand what they're grading it against. So don't put too much stock in the compliments of people. These men come to Jesus trying to deceive him, putting themselves off, pretending to be sincere, literally pretending to be righteous, that they might catch him in something he said so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. You see what they want to do there? They want to trip Jesus up in his word. They want to trick him, trap him, manipulate him into faltering in his word, saying something that he shouldn't say, so that then they can go through the proper legal channels to do the wrong thing. They actually want to do the wrong thing in the right way. They want to do the wrong thing in the right way. They want to do the wrong thing in the legal way. We'll talk about the law here in just a little bit, but understand this, people, that just because the law of the land says that you can do something, it does not mean that it's the right thing to do. It is never the right thing to do to go and to use a Planned Parenthood clinic. Even though the law of the land says you have every right to do that. You serve a higher law. You do not serve the law of the land as your ultimate supreme ruler. You serve God. And you cannot do the wrong things in the right way and it be okay. These men want to do that. And eventually they would kill Jesus. Not because they would manipulate him, but because he would hand his life over freely for us out of love. So look at verse 21. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God." Is there anything there in verse 21 that is false? There's not a word there in verse 21 that is false. But isn't that how all good lies begin? All good lies have an element of truth in them. That's how you are to believe them, okay? So listen to people all the way through before you accept their words. But look at what they say. They actually testify rightly about Jesus, and I think there's some exegetical significance here. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly." You've got that right. Not a word that Jesus has said has been unprofitable for us. Every single word, every single period that Jesus used has been very, very profitable to us. He teaches and speaks rightly. Not a word of Jesus has fallen to the ground. His word is living and active and powerful. But not only do they say that, but they say, "And you show no partiality." Literally, you do not receive a face. Well, that sounds weird. It essentially means this: Jesus, we know that you don't care how people look. We know that you don't care what office they occupy. You'll look a man in the face and you will tell him the truth. I pray that we are that kind of people, that we don't care what office a person occupies. We don't care how much money they have or how little money they have. We show the same truth bearing, the same truth speaking to the poor man and the rich man alike. But understand this, because this is the main truth here in that statement: you don't receive a face. Understand that the same way Jesus was then, he will be when we stand before him. When Jesus judges your life, when Jesus judges you at the end of your life, when you stand before or kneel before his throne, understand this, that Jesus shows no partiality. He will judge the poor man with no name the same way that he will judge the president. He'll judge a congressman the same way he will judge a pauper. He judges everybody the same way. He doesn't care what office you occupy. He doesn't care how big your house is. He doesn't care how much money you have. He doesn't care of the perceived reputation of your family in the community. That means nothing to God. He sees right through it. He does not receive a face. He shows no partiality. So just be honest with God and make sure the person you are in the quiet is the same person you are when it's loud. Make sure the same person you are in the dark is the same person you are when it is light, because God does not show partiality with any man. Let's go back to the text here. You show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Verse 22, here's the rub, here's the question. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? I'll say, well, that sounds like a harmless question. They're just asking, should we pay taxes? Well, when they say, is it lawful, they're talking about the Old Testament law. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Rome? We're only to give our money to God. Is it lawful for us to pay our taxes to Rome? Well, here's the deceit. Here's the trickery in their question. Think about this. Why won't they put Jesus to death right now? Why can't they lay hands on him? Because they fear the people, right? Because the people love Jesus. So the question is designed on one hand for one answer to separate the people from Jesus. Think about this. If Jesus says, yes, it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, guess who's separated from Jesus at that point? The people, the Jews, especially the Jewish patriots, because they don't want to pay taxes to Rome. They see Rome as the occupier. Why do you think they hated Levi so much? Why do you think they hated Zacchaeus so much? Tax collectors. Because those men were seen as the arm, as the hand of the government, the upside down hand that said, pay up. And when Zacchaeus came knocking on the door saying, give me money, he's not giving that money to the temple, he's giving that money to Tiberius. He's giving that money to another Caesar. And they see taxes as oppression. So if Jesus says, yes, it's lawful to pay taxes, you should pay your taxes, what are they going to say? You see, Jews, Jesus isn't for you. He's not a true Jew. But then on the other hand, if Jesus says, no, don't pay taxes to Caesar, guess who's an enemy of Jesus now? Rome. And Rome really doesn't care what anybody thinks. They'll just come and kill Jesus, or at least put him in prison. They will silence him because you will be paying your taxes to Rome. So if Jesus says yes or no, he's going to lose either way. And these men must have sat around and deliberated and contemplated and tried to figure out how they could trick Jesus. And finally they say, we've got a question we can take to Jesus, and he'll lose either way he answers. Little do they know, because they just don't believe, that they're actually dealing with God. And you can't trick or manipulate or trap God in his words. Is it lawful for us to pay tribute to Caesar or not? Here's Jesus' answer, verse 23. Actually, we'll think about 23 together for a second. But he perceived their craftiness. These men are pretending to be something that they are not. And Jesus does what? He sees right through it. He sees right through their facade, right through their pretending, right through their falsehood. What makes us think that Jesus is any different today than he was then? And yet we do this with people, don't we? We try to put on a false front. Somebody says, hey, how you doing today? What's the answer? Oh, I'm doing good. Really? Really? You doing good? You're hurting, you're dying, get a bad doctor's report, you're probably not doing so good. Good days are few and far between, right? But we are constantly putting up false impressions in front of people, wanting to make them think something about us that really isn't true. That's why we drive nice vehicles and buy big houses and things like that, so we can put off airs to people. But these men are pretending to be something to Jesus that they're really not. And Jesus sees right through it. Why be fake before Jesus? This is a question for all of us. Why be false before Jesus? If he sees right through it, why live in hypocrisy? Why not just be honest? Why not just be real and be raw before God and say, God, this is who I am. Tell your friends, say, hey, this is who I am. And you know what? If they don't like that, they can go. They're not a true friend anyway. Just be honest and be real. Jesus sees through these false impressions anyway, but he perceived their craftiness and said to them, verse 24 and 25, spectacular. Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. He said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Amazing answer here. He says, get a coin out, get a denarius out. Whose picture is on that coin? We say, well, Caesar's. And whose name does it say? Well, it says Caesar. He says, well, it must belong to Caesar then, right? So give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. What's Jesus' answer? Now this text, many people go here because they want to know about taxes. Is this text primarily about taxes? No, it's not. The text is about wicked men trying to deceive Jesus, and he stumps them. Okay? Nobody like Jesus. That's the point of the text. Okay? And a greater point there implicit that we'll get to in a moment. But he does talk about taxes. It's a little bit of a sideline issue that he deals with here. So what does Jesus say about taxes? We ought to pay our taxes and obey the law. That is the Christian ethic, that we be model citizens. This is why, and please listen to me, this is why it is a logical anomaly that any government would not support Christians. It is a logical anomaly that any government would not support Christians. Because if a Christian is a Christian, he's going to be a good citizen. He's going to pay his taxes. He's going to go the speed limit. He's not going to rob his neighbor. He's not going to hold up a bank. He's not going to chop off the head of somebody that disagrees with him. And if a government would actually read the Bible, they would see that Christians aren't going to kill people who disagree with them. They're not going to shoot up malls. They're not going to rob banks. They're not going to break laws. They ought to be model citizens. That's why it makes no sense whatsoever that a government would not support Christians. And because it makes no sense that they would not do that, it tells you there's something else at play. It's not about being logical. There's something supernatural, something spiritual going on, where lawlessness would actually be encouraged. But I digress. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Pay your taxes. Obey the law. Look at verse 26. Amazing. And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. Literally, verse 26 says, and they did not have the power in the presence of the people to catch him when he said. They just weren't able. They just didn't have enough of it in them to trick or trap or to manipulate Jesus. Friend, there's no point in trying to manipulate God. There's no point in trying to trick God. If these men couldn't do it, neither can we. But why do people try to trick God? Why do they try to manipulate God? Why do people think that they can make God think something that they can make their neighbor to think? God knows all. You don't trick, trap, or manipulate God. And again, there really is just no point in arguing with God. We've done this a couple of times already. I've made this point because we've seen it time and again here in the Gospel of Luke. There is no point in arguing with God. People say, people who are rebellious, people who don't love God, people who are angry about their life, you'll often hear people say things like this. Well, when I die and I stand before God, I'm going to tell him a thing or two. I'm going to say, have you read the Bible? Because if you stand before the God of the Bible and you think you're going to tell him a thing or two, do you know what happens to people who stand before the God of the Bible, people who stand before Jesus? You know what they do? They don't stand. They actually kneel. They marvel. Look at this. Look at what the text says. It is absolutely amazing. They come to trick, trap, and manipulate to deceive Jesus, catch him in what he's saying, and they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. Jesus answers, and they just go, this guy's awesome. Nobody talks like this. Nobody answers like this. We've never encountered somebody with this kind of wisdom. You could imagine, and maybe this is just purely conjecture, not based on the text. You could imagine maybe even some of them begin to question, maybe I should follow Jesus. I've never heard anybody talk like this. We deliberated for weeks, maybe days. We talked about this with tons of people how to trap Jesus. We had the perfect question, and we served it up to him like a T-ball. We can't contend with Jesus, nor can you contend with God. That's the point. You can't contend with Jesus because you can't contend with God. So friend, don't argue with God. Don't think that you're going to stand before him one day when you die and tell him a thing or two about how you didn't like how your life turned out. Guess what? God didn't have to give you life. God didn't have to give you a moment of fresh air. He didn't have to give you any good thing. We talked about it last night, some friends and I. We talked about this. The amazing thing is not that some people die terrible deaths. The amazing thing is that all people don't die terrible deaths. The amazing, incredible, unbelievable thing is not that God would send some people to hell. The amazing and incredible thing is that God would send anybody to heaven. That's what's incredible, and yet we want to contend with God and tell him how he should have made us. Well, next time you create a world, you make it how you want it. No one contends with God. Nobody argues with God. It's foolishness. It's folly. Better to be like these men at the end of the text who say, this guy is awesome. Marveled at Jesus. But I feel like I left something out here, so let's go back. The point is not to pay taxes. I don't even know that the main point is necessarily that these men were astonished with Jesus, so they tried to trick him and they failed. I think that there's a deeper point here, an implicit point taken out of the text here. Look back with me at verse 24 and 25. Show me a denarius, show me a coin. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. He said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. He said, pull out a coin. You could pull out a dollar bill, you could pull out a quarter, you could pull out any mode of currency that you could find in your pocket. You could look on it, and what would you find? You would find the imprint of a leader, of a president. So guess what you do with that quarter? Give to the government the things that are the government's. It has their name, it has their face on it, so give it to them. But here's what I wish I had this morning. I don't have one on me, I don't have any coins in my pocket, but this is what I wish I had on me. I wish I had enough mirrors for every person in this room to hold in front of you and for you to look in that mirror and to use the logic that Jesus uses. He says, you look at your money. Whose image does it bear? Caesar's? It must belong to Caesar. You look in the mirror. Whose image do you bear? You bear God's image. Pay your taxes to Caesar, and you pay your life to God. That's the point of the text. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, the Bible tells us, God tells us there in the beginning as Moses writes this out for us, that God made man in his image. Male and female, he created them. You and I bear the image of God. We are his sole image bearers in this world. Adam and Eve were created in perfection, bearing perfectly the image of God there in the garden. But what did they do not too long after they were in the garden? The devil tempted them, the serpent tempted them, and they fell. And what happened to the image of God there in the garden? It becomes marred. It becomes not what God made. It becomes something that is corrupt, and now it is dying. Now it is diseased. Now it is feeling pain. And this is what you and I do all the time. We mar the image of God in us. Though we are to render to God the things that are God's, though we are to give to God the things that bear His image, namely our soul, namely our being. And yet Adam and Eve marred the image of God there in the garden, and every single one of us, all of us in Adam's posterity, we bear that marred, fallen image. And just as Adam dies, so do all men die. But this is the incredible part. This is where it gets really, really amazing. It's not just amazing that God would make man in His image in the world, but think of this. Think of Christmas. Now that man has marred God's image in him, God has made Himself in the image of man. Emmanuel, God with us. And Jesus bears our image, and He bears the image of God in complete union, walking in perfection, walking in holiness. And then He takes that perfect image, the radiance of the glory of God, as it says in Hebrews 1:3. He takes that perfect being, that perfect image, and He gives His life there on the cross so that God destroys the image of man in Jesus. Punishes the image of man in Jesus. And then He takes Jesus, and to all those who believe in Him, He takes the image of God and He puts it on top of them. The Bible tells us in the book of Romans chapter 8 that God is actually making us back into the image of Jesus, conforming us to His image. Are you rendering to God the things that are God's? Pay your taxes. You know that. Next point. Render to God. Some people in here, you have no problem at all paying your taxes. Maybe you do. Maybe you grit your teeth, but you still pay your taxes. But one thing you have refused to do up to this point, you have not surrendered to God the image that belongs to Him. And this morning, you need to understand that you must surrender the image of Him. Surrender your person, surrender your being to God, to follow after Jesus, the one who died for your sins, that you may be forgiven, that you may have everlasting life. You may render to Caesar, but do you render to God the things that belong to God? Would you pray with me?